And with that, I'm going to start the recording and stop sharing my screen and hand it over to our speakers for today, because I know you're more interested in hearing from them. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks for those introductions. Thanks also to Ada. As advertised, we are going to deliver a presentation to you today on understanding carbon credits. Our goal is to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes. I see it's already 9 minutes past the hour, so we've used up a little of our time already. We'll be as economical as we can be, but we are excited to talk to you about the opportunities that carbon credit projects offer. And then there will be a little bit of time for questions and discussion. But I should also say, please feel very free to raise a hand whilst we're delivering the presentation, or to put a question into the chat, and we can try and have an interactive conversation as we go. But in the meantime then, so with Dom and Jason, the three of us are going to provide you with the presentation that is structured as follows, as you can see on the slide. So the first part is going to sort of look at concepts that will help understand carbon credits. Then the second part is going to look at how to develop and finance a carbon credit project. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and a checklist. So over to Dom, I think, is going to lead us off on the first slide here.
Yeah, I probably got the easiest slide, the first one. So it's very nice meeting every one of you. And let me just reiterate what Nick just said. So please jump in if you have any experience or any questions on carbon credit projects, because what is really interesting about this space is that it needs to have, there are so many stakeholders involved, oftentimes from developed and developing countries, and all of them need to work together. So if you have any experience in carbon credit project, we would be very grateful if you would share that experience with us and with your fellow colleagues on the webinar. So let's first start with the question of what is a carbon credit. So in essence, a carbon credit is a tradable certificate giving the owner of that certificate the right to emit a certain amount, 1 ton of emissions. And so that raises the question of why do we have a market for carbon credits? And the response to that question is essentially because there is demand for it. There are certain entities that are willing to purchase a carbon credit, that are willing to purchase the right to emit carbon. And which are those entities? Well, there are first of all companies. So as you know, there are a lot of companies that are voluntarily making net zero pledges that their emissions are essentially zero. Of course, as we know, in the short term, very often those companies are not able to reduce their own emissions from their own activities to zero. So what they do is that the emissions that they have and that they're not able to cut themselves to zero, they purchase carbon credits. And carbon credits and carbon offsets are two terms which essentially refer to the same issue. So if we speak today about carbon offsets and carbon credits, that's essentially speaking about the same thing. It's that right to emit carbon. So companies will purchase those carbon offsets to offset their own emissions. Sometimes companies not just voluntarily purchase carbon offset, but are mandated under the law and are required under the law to purchase carbon offset. One example thereof is, for instance, for international aviation, where airlines are obliged to purchase a certain amount of carbon offset to offset their own emissions as a result of the international aviation. Under Swiss law, for instance, just to give another example, there is a requirement on fossil motor fuel producers, again, to purchase carbon offset to offset the emissions resulting from the use of fossil fuels. So that's a requirement under law on certain entities, companies, to purchase carbon offset. You could also have individuals like you and me who are getting more and more concerned about their own carbon footprint and who may want to wish carbon offset to offset their own emissions. And so they may also demand and may be willing to pay a price to purchase a carbon offset. And then last but not least, you have the countries around the globe that have committed themselves under international law under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions. And under that Paris Agreement, they could achieve their obligations also by purchasing carbon offsets and in that way reduce their emissions. So you see that on the one hand, there is a demand. There are entities that are willing to pay a price for carbon credits, and that has created a supply of those carbon credits. And that supply often takes place in developing countries, in a host country where a project is developed that will result in the reduction of carbon emissions. And it's that reduction in carbon emissions that will result in a carbon credit. So that carbon credit is sold to those entities that want to purchase a carbon credit. And as a result of that financing, the financing of that carbon credit makes it possible to develop those projects in host countries. So as you see on this figure, that's in a nutshell what a carbon credit is about and why we see a market for carbon credits.
Thanks, Dom. So I think the neat thing about offsets is that they allow you to negate emissions that arise in one place from one set of activities with a saving in emissions that occurs in another place from another set of activities. So the 1 ton that is emitted, for example, in Switzerland through motor fuels can be offset by a saving of emissions in another place through a completely different set of activities. Conceptually, then, the idea, I think, is fairly straightforward. To have emission savings, there are 3 different ways that you can have emission savings, which I've put on the slide here. The first is to have an activity that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, that involves fewer emissions than might otherwise have been the case. So an example of that is clean cook stoves, where by swapping out traditional cook stoves for clean cook stoves, you undertake an activity that involves fewer emissions, or you could undertake an activity which might typically be conducted using fossil fuels by using renewable fuels. So again, you would undertake the activity in a way that reduces emissions by reference to what normally would happen. Second way to create carbon credits is to remove greenhouse gas emissions from the environment. One example of that would be effectively locking up the carbon, locking up the emissions in nature through forestation. So planting trees and capturing that carbon through natural growth. And there are also emerging technologies to capture carbon from the atmosphere. So effectively, carbon that is emitted through industrial processes or pulling it directly from the atmosphere, and then locking up the carbon in geological formations like saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas reservoirs, so locking it up deep underground. Third way to create carbon credits is to avoid emissions entirely. And the main example of offset projects that avoid emissions entirely would be not undertaking an activity like deforestation that would release emissions. And there are examples of countries being provided with financial resources in return for not cutting down trees because that involves avoiding emissions.
So that's in a nutshell the type of activities that you could conduct in a host country, the type of projects that you could conduct. And the next slide gives a few examples thereof. And Nick spoke already of the example of clean cooking, where traditional ways of cooking are replaced by a more energy efficient way of cooking. And you see on the picture what that involves. And so the difference between the emissions resulting from the traditional way of cooking with the way of cooking based on the using the clean cook equipment, that difference is essentially creating the carbon credit that is then sold on the market. The other examples is the other one on the right-hand side. You'll see in India a renewable energy project that again reduces the emissions. on the left-hand side below, you'll see in Kenya a project that wants to avoid deforestation, which is an example of avoiding the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. On the right-hand side, on the bottom right-hand side, and if we have people from Vietnam, they may know more about it. It's quite an interesting example also because it shows you that, and that might be very relevant for you, that you could also think about using carbon credits to finance technological innovation. That is really important. So the traditional examples of clean cooking may not resonate that well with the activities that you're undertaking, but if you're involved in certain types of activities that you believe will result in a reduction of emissions, you may think about developing a carbon credit project that will help you and finance essentially your ideas to reduce your emissions. And this example is essentially from Vietnam, where the leftovers of the production of rice, so-called husk, that is a leftover from the processing of rice into oil, oftentimes finds its way into rivers. And as a result of the decay thereof, it seems that there will be there are a lot of emissions into the atmosphere. And so to avoid that increase in emissions, this project came up with an alternative use of that husk, where the husk is used by the project developer to create electricity. So the leftover of the processing of rice into oil does not find its way into the rivers, but is used in a more efficient way, is used in a technological, innovative way to produce electricity. And so that again, that project is financed based on the use of carbon credits.
Thanks, Tom. So we just had a question in the chat box, which I think is a very pertinent and astute question. And note that if we're talking about emission savings, then there is obviously a question of quantification. So how do you go about quantifying the emission savings that you have from a particular project? And that, I think, is a nice segue into this slide, which looks at the different stakeholders who are involved in carbon offset projects. Dom has already noted that in carbon offset projects, there's often a project, well, typically in a carbon offset project, you have a project which is undertaken in one part of the world, and then you generate the offset certificates, and they are sold to be used in another part of the world. So there are definitely dots which have to be connected here. And this slide identifies some of the stakeholders that are involved in connecting those dots. And also when it comes to questions of methodological quantification. So if we start on the left and we put ourselves in your shoes as the youth ecopreneurs interested in developing a project, so you come up with an idea for a project that would involve some saving of emissions. So reducing emissions, removing emissions, or avoiding emissions. And you decide that you want to go down the road of trying to develop that project and turn the idea into offset certificates. So how would you go about that? And who would be the other stakeholders that you would have to engage with? Well, on the top row of this slide, you can see that we've identified auditors and then offset programs and schemes. So when it comes to methodologies, there are a number of registries out there, offset programs and schemes, that have sets of rules and methodologies that effectively govern the way an offset program has to be conducted and determine how many offset certificates you will get from your program. And if you want to generate those certificates, then you have to follow the rules typically of one of these programs or schemes. And you can see up here the names of some of these programs and schemes, Vera, Gold Standard. And so they have a set of different rules, a set of standards, if you like, that govern the way offset projects are run, and that will determine how many certificates you will get for your offset project. So if you're thinking about developing a project, then I think a key first step would be understanding where your project might fit within those rules, perhaps shopping around between the different registries and trying to figure out how you could optimize your project to generate the highest number of certificates and to get the best possible standard rating from one of these organizations. You can also imagine that there are, if you have rules and methodologies about how a project is run, then you will have rules about monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is where the auditors come in. At the bottom on the left, we've identified investors. So there is quite a lot of capital that is available to help you develop these projects. And in fact, Jason has already mentioned that some of the work that our firm does is to work with investors and funders in helping develop offset projects. Once you have your project up and running, you have your accreditation, and you've respected the rules on quantification, and you've got your certificates issued, then you can start selling your certificates, and there are markets for the sale of offsets. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And ultimately, those offsets will end up in the hands of buyers, and Dom's described them already. They could be companies, they could be individuals, they could be governments, they could be buying for purposes of their own regulatory compliance, or simply to meet their voluntary pathway to net zero. There's another, we've taken this diagram from a consultant, Paya, which it's a consultant on the demand side. But there's another stakeholder that's not mentioned on here, and that is consultants on the supply side. So very typically, if you have an idea for a project, then very typically the way that you would get that project off the ground is by working with a consultant with experience in developing a project, in working with the registries like Verra and Gold Standard, in working with investors, and even in selling, in helping you sell the offset certificates, possibly to get advanced finance through the door at an earlier point in time. So you wouldn't be alone. You can see in developing one of these projects, there's a lot of help out there, and consultants are another aspect of that help, which is not shown on our slide. So, I mean, I like to think of carbon credits as effectively a win-win. So they are climate positive, they are sustainable development positive, and they are also an opportunity to tap into capital to finance development projects in developing countries. Effectively, you can secure private sector funding, both from investors and from buyers, for climate positive, sustainable development projects. So what's not to like? Well, offsets have come under considerable criticism. Part of that criticism is that the critics argue that offsets are really an excuse for buyers, companies and countries, even individuals, to do nothing to reduce their own emissions. And so I think savvy users of offsets in the market understand that the first thing they have to do is work to reduce their own emissions. But there's also a criticism that is made of offsets themselves, and that is that projects are very often effectively greenwashing, and they don't really result in emissions savings. So to address that criticism and to ensure that we reap the benefits of this win-win, we need to have offsets and offset projects that have a high degree of reliability and integrity. To ensure that reliability and integrity, there is a set of principles that has been developed that offset projects need to meet.
Yeah, and so on that set of principles, which is quite highlighted on the slide because it's really important for you if you think about developing a project, then you want to produce carbon credits of a high quality. And so then you have to think through whether your project would indeed meet these requirements. And the first requirement is potentially the most important requirement, because if you don't meet the first requirement, your project is not going to be eligible to create carbon credits. And that is the additionality requirement, which in essence means that the emission reductions achieved by the project need to be additional. It means that they should not have occurred, they would not have occurred, those emission reductions, without the financing, without the revenue resulting from the sale of carbon credits. If the emission reductions would have happened anyway, without the revenue resulting from the carbon credit, your carbon credit program does not result in an additional emission reduction. And so that's why we have that criteria of additionality. In concrete terms, that means that if you think about your project, a key and a decisive element of whether your project is going to be eligible is whether you need the financing from the sale of the carbon credits for your project to go ahead. If you have a project that will reduce emissions for which you can find any other type of financing, and you don't need the revenue from the carbon credits, then in principle, your project will not meet the requirement of additionality. So the decisive element for your project to go ahead is to get that revenue from the sale of the carbon credit. It also means additionality that if you're required under the law in the country in which you would like to undertake your project, if the regulator requires you to reduce your emissions in the way that you aim at reducing them in the project, then again, your project is not additional. So it needs to go essentially beyond what you're required to do under the law and beyond what you would be able to achieve without the revenue from the carbon credits. So that's the first criteria on additionality. Then the second one, and that goes to the question of the quantification. You want to have a very robust quantification of the emission reductions. And that's in practice very often very difficult and very sensitive as well, because the amount of carbon credits and so the revenue that you will generate as a result of your project will be the difference between the emissions that will result from the implementation of your project that are compared against what is called baseline emissions, namely those emissions that would have occurred without the project. So that is, of course, going to be a higher set of emissions without the project. You compare that baseline set of emissions against the actual emissions that will result as a result of the implementation of your project. And you'll see that there might be an incentive for project developers and other stakeholders to inflate the so-called baseline emissions, namely those emissions that would have taken place without the implementation of the project. Because if they do so, they generate more carbon credits, which will result in a higher level of revenue. So you want to make sure that your methodology is robust and in essence is conservative in estimating the baseline emissions. Those emissions, for instance, if we go back to the clean cooking example, those emissions that would have taken place if the clean cooking project would not have been implemented, and if instead people would still have used a traditional way of cooking, you have to quantify those baseline emissions in a conservative way. And Nick already mentioned that you have methodology, so you're not on your own on developing the methodology on how to do that quantification. The carbon crediting projects or programs have sort of off-the-shelf methodologies, definitely for the project that they're used to implement, like clean cooking. They have methodologies that will help you to quantify those emission reductions. If you have an innovative project that has not yet been registered under such a program, you can always propose a new methodology, and that new methodology might still be accepted by the program if it meets the conditions of that particular program. So that's the second criteria, a robust quantification of your emission reductions. The third one is the principle of no double counting. So in principle, an emission reduction can be used only once. if you're in a host country where you develop a project and you can convince your government not to use the carbon reduction to meet its own requirements under international law, under the Paris Agreement, then that credit will be called a so-called adjusted credit. And that credit will be seen as having higher quality and higher integrity in the market. And that credit will therefore be able to be sold at a higher price. That credit will also have to meet the requirements under the Paris Agreement that were adopted last year, the so-called Paris Rulebook. It doesn't mean that if you cannot convince your government not to use your credit that you have achieved based on your project, if you cannot convince your government not to use it itself, then in that situation, that host country, your country, will still use that credit to reduce its own emissions. In such a situation, you could still sell your carbon credit. So it's not a sort of a red line that you're not able to sell your carbon credit anymore. That carbon credit will have less credibility. It will also be more difficult to use it in certain markets, but it's still a valuable carbon credit. The value of that credit will just be less. It's really important if you think through a carbon credit project, whether or not you'll be able to convince your government not to use a credit to meet its own climate obligations. You also want the emission reductions to be permanent. You don't want a reversal of the emission reductions. So that means that you need to also have protection in place, that there is no mismanagement of the project. And also that if it's a reforestation or a forestation type of project, that you try not to have the trees burned down, because that of course will reverse the emission reductions that are achieved as a result of the project. And maybe Jason, you want to give an example here of how that could be avoided?
Yeah, it's not necessarily something that's incorporated into methodologies or protocols that the registries have put together. The registries typically take measures to ensure permanence, or at least reduce the risk of reversals that would cause an overestimation of emissions reductions from a project, such as withholding credits in a buffer pool. So say you've avoided 10,000 metric tons of carbon emissions. Theoretically, you'd be entitled to 10,000 carbon credits under the methodologies, under the proper methodology. Perhaps the registry would withhold 3 to 5% of those credits in an issuance and create a sort of buffer pool reserve in case there's a reversal in the future. Another thing some registries do is require the project proponent to enter into a reversal risk mitigation agreement where they agree to take measures to mitigate the risk of reversals, like place land use restrictions on the land to avoid project risk management or cutting down trees in the future in the forestry example. But allocating the risk from reversals is something that's typically a negotiated issue. And just to fill in all the blanks, the typical standard for permanence is that the emissions would have to be removed or reduced for 100 years.
Right, and so it's, as Jason said, you can't really, of course, avoid when you start a project. You never know what will happen, right? But there are ways to deal with that risk. That's in a nutshell, I think, what you have to keep in mind. What you also have to keep in mind, and what I think is becoming more and more important, is that there is recognition that those projects that may reduce carbon emission reductions, that they may also have potentially a negative impact on the social rights or other environmental impacts that might not necessarily be positive. So you could think about a forestation project that may intervene with the rights of indigenous people. And so there is more and more recognition that if you develop a project, that at a minimum you should avoid having or causing harm to broader sustainable development objectives, but that ideally also has a positive impact, for instance, on the rights of indigenous people. So you would have to have procedures in place that ensures that those persons are consulted as well, that there is a grievance proceeding in place as well that takes into consideration indeed that the rights of indigenous people or other social rights might be affected by a carbon credit project. And finally, as you can imagine, transparency is really key in this market, right? You have to be very transparent in monitoring the reduction of the emissions resulting from the project, in reporting those reductions, but also in independent verification by auditors. So an auditor will typically come in and will verify that indeed the emission reductions that were set out in the project and that were achieved through the project did actually happen in reality. So if those are in essence the 6 key elements that will determine the quality of your carbon credit. Now, if you look at the carbon credit market, you'll see there is a lot of divergence on how those 6 principles are implemented among carbon crediting programs. So Nick already mentioned some of them, like Gold Standard and Verra. If you look into their rules, they have very different rules on those 6 principles. Also, you have an international certification scheme, which is now which used to be the CDM, which is now going to be replaced by a new mechanism that is not yet in place. That new mechanism, the so-called Sustainable Development Mechanism that was agreed on by parties last year, once it's operational, also has its own implementation of those 6 quality provisions or quality requirements. So it means that if you, and I don't want to lose you on this slide, so I'll be very quick on this slide. I think the key takeaway from this slide is that you'll see that there is a lot of fragmentation still in the market. On the demand side, as we discussed how they are used to carbon credit, each regulator, like the Swiss regulator, like the International Aviation Organization, each regulator defines its own quality criteria that are required for the use of a carbon credit. In the voluntary market, you see there are no standards whatsoever. So if a company wants to use a carbon credit, it doesn't matter what the quality of that carbon credit is at the moment. It can choose and it can purchase whatever carbon credit, even if it doesn't meet those 6 principles that we've discussed above. And then on top of that, you have the fragmentation, or you have the diversity among the carbon crediting programs. So you'll see a market with a lot of fragmentation, also with a lot of quality concerns. One carbon credit is not the same as another carbon credit. It could be very different. The Article 6 rulebook or the Paris rulebook that I've mentioned to some extent will try to reduce the level of fragmentation that we see in the market, and will hopefully also increase overall the quality of the carbon credits that we see in the market. Nick, I think this one is for you.
Thanks, Dom. I was actually answering something in the chat. So yeah, this last slide basically picks up on some points that we see happening in some dynamics that we see happening in the marketplace. I'm not going to go through this in great detail in the interest of time, just to pick up the sort of high level points. So the first is that we see increased integrity in carbon credits, and we think that will increase over time. So this focus on making sure credits are reliable, we think is one that will increase over time. At the moment, there's a lot of fragmentation, relatively limited regulation, and we think that will also change over the next 5 to 10 years. And so this push towards increased integrity. Second point is that we see growing demand for carbon credits. We think that there will be growing demand both as a result of compliance requirements. So the two examples Dom already gave, the system for offsetting aviation emissions and the Swiss system for offsetting road fuel emissions. We think there will be more examples of that will create demand for offset. And obviously, you're probably all seeing more and more companies and even individuals seeking to reduce their own emissions, and to the extent that they can't reduce their own emissions, being willing to do so through the purchase of offset. The market is very fragmented at the moment, and so you see different prices for different types of offset. I think a third thing that we can expect to see is that there will be a price premium for the higher quality credits, and in particular for credits that meet the new international rules that were agreed in Glasgow, which implement aspects of the Paris Agreement. So over time, probably less fragmentation, less volatility, more demand, and more integrity. So now we hand over to Jason, who's going to get more into the nuts and bolts of developing and financing a project.
Thank you. Yes, and mindful of time, I want to leave some time to answer questions too. So I'll be as quick as I can. So we're seeing the carbon credit market becoming a very attractive source of financing from carbon credit brokers and others who are looking to monetize carbon credits, not necessarily just end users. It is important to understand how to efficiently leverage potentially carbon credit generating activities to get financing. I've seen some discussion in the chat of the costs of the various registries, and so sort of want to cover that as well. We'll look at a high level at the different structures that these carbon credit investments can take, what investors are looking for in their due diligence, and then we'll quickly go over a few considerations you should keep in mind when choosing counsel to represent you in a carbon credit-based financing. You can move on to the next slide. So there are three general buckets we're seeing for agreements related to carbon credit financings. Generally, these are balance sheet financings, project governance agreements, and commodities contracts. Starting from the leftmost and likely the most time consuming to negotiate in paper are balance sheet investments. A priced equity round is the typical investment structure for a startup, and I think this audience should be familiar with that process, so I'll skip the details. Suffice it to say that if you're going out for a priced equity round, you might consider reaching out to carbon brokers, other investors who might be interested in carbon credits to see if they would be interested in joining the round. When a carbon credit investment is made in parallel to an equity financing, we would usually see the company enter into a side agreement separate from the equity financing documents to cover the terms of the project investment and the carbon credit delivery. Just as a note, that investor would likely request that the execution of the commercial side agreement be a condition precedent to making the equity investment. So it's important to have the commercial discussions simultaneously with the equity investment negotiation. If you're not going out for a priced equity round, one alternative is to offer debt, usually in the form of a loan or a promissory note. In carbon credit-backed debt deals, we typically see the debt secured by or repayable in carbon credits. You might also be able to negotiate for more favorable interest rates on a loan based on meeting certain ESG-based KPIs. We're seeing European banks starting to consider carbon emissions in loan agreements, not so much in the United States yet. One unique consideration I wanted to mention for debt financings in the carbon credit market is that the creditor might ask for the carbon credits or rights to receive the carbon credits in the future as collateral. And in that case, you would want to consult with counsel on potentially setting up a project vehicle or a separate legal entity to isolate the collateral for the creditor. Just wanted to mention that, you should definitely discuss that with counsel. There would be tax and security considerations, particularly if you're transferring assets across jurisdictions. The next category of financing structures are what you might call project governance agreements. These arrangements in general treat the project as a collaboration between the parties. They can be quicker to paper than debt or equity agreements, but they can also take much longer, depends on how bespoke the terms are that the investor is requesting. So starting with the project development contract, it relates to one particular project and includes terms around decision-making mechanisms for issues related to the project, a detailed budget, including potentially registry costs for project activities. It also ought to describe the split between the carbon credits, between the project developer, the investor, and any other stakeholders, and should include, some thought about which parties would monetize the carbon credits. Typically, it would be the investor or the broker. And it will set out, other terms and conditions for various project-related activities like project monitoring rights, publicity rights, default and termination rights, dispute resolution, and the like. Zooming out a bit, a framework agreement can be thought of as an agreement to agree on project development contracts in the future. Typically there, the parties would enter into a framework agreement at an early stage in the project developer's life cycle, potentially before you have any sort of projects in mind. And that particular investor would be providing startup costs or financing for multiple potential projects. And then in exchange for the investor's funds, the investor would typically negotiate for an exclusive first option to some or all of the developer's projects and all the carbon credits derived, therefrom. They might also want to hard code in a few of the terms that they would expect to see in eventual project development agreements. The last bucket, and potentially the simplest and quickest option in some circumstances, is to treat the carbon credits as a commodity. And the two structures I wanted to highlight here are spot purchases and forward contracts. So a spot purchase governs the purchase and sale of existing carbon credits for an immediate or near-term transfer to a purchaser. If you don't have a project in mind, on the other hand, a forward contract is essentially a pre-purchase, where in a forward contract, the investor pays the money in advance in exchange for an obligation from the developer to deliver a specified quantity of carbon credits at a certain time in the future. Interestingly, we're actually seeing forward contracts in the carbon credit market being used in place of early stage equity investments. And at the same time, they can also look really similar to framework agreements. They're a very flexible, piece of paper for a carbon credit financing. So the reason that commodity contracts are generally simpler and quicker than some of the other options is that most of the material terms and conditions of commodities contracts are incorporated into the contract by reference to the ISDA documentation, or International Swaps and Derivatives Association documentation. I won't go into any detail here at all. Suffice it to say that lawyers who are familiar with these sort of terms in the ISDA documentation can get to an agreement very quickly on a piece of paper. So underlying these three different kinds of structures are just a few sort of deliverables I wanted to highlight that you might hear about if you're discussing a potential carbon credit investment. So the difference between these three deliverables, project idea notes or PINs, feasibility studies, and a final sort of project design document, is essentially the stage of development of the project. Very early on in a project development process, potentially before you really have any concrete ideas for a project, you might deliver PINs. They're simple data sheets with technical specs for the project, usually produced in consultation with a carbon consultant or a technical advisor, like Nick mentioned. And investors here would be looking for metrics that would have some influence on the social good being performed by the project, as well as the cost of their investment into the project. So things like geographic location for the project, blended average cost for generating the carbon credits based on the anticipated impact of the project versus the amount of funding you're asking for. And that's something that's usually expressed in a value of dollars per metric ton of emissions reductions, or currency per metric ton of emission reductions. A feasibility study is similar to a PIN. It's generally more detailed and would be produced usually entirely by a carbon consultant or technical advisor. And investors would be looking for similar metrics, just a little bit more detailed, a little bit more concrete. So to take the agroforestry example, perhaps a proposed geographic area of land, in particular hectares, canopy cover metrics, things like that. And then lastly, the project design document is the document that's actually submitted to the registry for project validation. And it just includes the most granular level of detail, but similar kind of metrics and data points. So that's sort of a quick and dirty background on the different financing structures and some of the deliverables involved in carbon credit financing. So on the next slide, we can discuss how to prepare for investors' diligence process. And I think it's worth mentioning up front that in the carbon credit market right now, diligence varies very widely among different investors in this market. But here are a few things that generally an investor should look at. And so, best to be prepared in case you have the most sort of intensive diligence process that's out there right now. I'll start with methodology and then move clockwise. So Dom and Nick, and it's something we've mentioned throughout the presentation, is that investors want to purchase the highest quality credits available. So the methodology or protocol that you're using to assess your project is a really critical factor for determining whether the credits would be of a high quality and a good reputation. Mindful of time, I'm going to skip ahead to the verification timeline. Verification is the sort of technical term for an actual carbon credit issuance event. It's when a third-party auditor associated with the registry reviews project data, potentially visits the project site, and verifies that the emissions reductions have actually occurred. And then your carbon credits or certificates are issued on the registry. And so it's important to have a timeline in mind when you're discussing with the investor. They may price their investment based on an anticipated delay between the investment and the delivery event. They may insist on calling it a default if carbon credits aren't delivered before a certain date. So it's important to have a realistic understanding of the timeline. A third thing is that investors would want to review and maybe even have input into your agreements with local stakeholders and the host country. Local stakeholders would be folks like the landowner, if you're planting trees, distributors, if you're involved in other sorts of projects. They often need to assign the right to receive carbon credits to you. So investors will want to see the paper between you and local stakeholders and make sure that you have all the rights you need. And for agreements with the host country, investors may want to see, like Dom mentioned, an agreement from the host country not to count the credits issued under your project against their own emission reduction targets. And so in that case, we'd call those adjusted credits, as Dom mentioned. Moving along quickly, organizational documents and management, more of a paperwork point. Just be sure to mention to counsel any potential red flags in your paperwork or in your management team to make sure you can best address those. If you've pledged to deliver any carbon credits from the projects that are being financed to others, the investors would be very focused on that. Potentially your technical consultant who would help you develop your feasibility study might have an option to be paid in carbon credits. And so investors would be very focused on flexibility you have to pay them, the quantum of credits that are available after payment to the technical consultant. And then last but not least, pricing of the carbon credits is sort of tied to all the other factors in diligence. It can also influence the investor's diligence process. I don't have much more to say about pricing, particularly considering timing here. Thank you, Julia. 5 minutes left. So I think we can move on to vetting counsel. And here there's not a whole lot to say, just to keep in mind that when you're looking for counsel to represent you in these negotiations, you'll want to make sure that they understand all the various topics we've discussed today. It's a very technical kind of market with a lot of regulatory dynamics at play. It's helpful if they have an expertise in New York law, particularly if you're looking at a forward contract or a spot purchase agreement, because ISDA documentation is generally governed by New York law. That's the market standard. And then it's also helpful if they have some direct experience, obviously, with carbon credit financings, or the most similar thing would be project finance, debt finance, or commodities trading.
If I can just jump in, Jason, on vetting counsel, just to recall what Ada said at the beginning, which is Sidley has a pro bono program for small, medium-sized for-profit enterprises. And so if your company is eligible for our pro bono program, then you may be able to enlist the services of folks like Jason under the pro bono program to help with a project.
Yeah, and that's maybe a useful segue into the final slide, also looking at the time that we got a lot of really interesting questions in the chat box, and which was precisely, I think, the purpose of today's call, that we would trigger those interesting questions. So I'd say, like, feel free to reach out to us if you have those questions. Well, you will get the presentation with our email address. So again, feel free to reach out, and potentially we could work under our pro bono program to help you with those particular questions. I think just to conclude today's session, what is the key takeaway is that there is really a lot of interest from a lot of stakeholders to develop high quality carbon credit projects, including with small enterprises. And small enterprises, as we've seen in the chat box, will raise specific concerns like what's the cost for registration under the different registers, which may indeed differ among those registers. Can I potentially also group emission reductions that a lot of different companies have achieved? So all of those practical questions are really important. And I think if you want to discuss those practical questions with us, feel free to reach out to us. And keep in mind that this is indeed potentially a very viable and a good way to finance emission reductions that you have in mind and for which you may want to need or which you may want to involve carbon credits. And as we've mentioned here on this slide, I think the access to the stakeholders is really important, the project developers, the carbon consultants, and all of the other stakeholders. But again, if you want us to be involved as well or in helping you to get access to those stakeholders, feel free to reach out. And thanks a lot for all the interest in today's presentation. And I hope that we may speak again on this topic or potentially on other topic. Thank you.
Excellent.
Sorry, Claire, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you to you all. First off, Dominic, Nicholas, and Jason for doing this session. Super informative, super concise. So first off, because this is a youthful audience, if you guys can share some emojis, some reactions in the chat, just to give our speakers a big thumbs up that we appreciate your guys' time today. We do already have a hand raised from Sushil. So Sushil, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for a very informative and a very relevant discussion. Can you hear me all, please, or should I? We can hear you, yes. Yeah. So I wish to thank you all for a very relevant and very useful discussion. My question was, we are working with very small factories, who might be reducing the carbon emission by, say, 1 ton in a month or 1 ton in 15 days, but there would be a cluster, like 30 or 40 factories working together. So can they make a cluster and form one carbon credit project?
I'll go first on that. I mean, I think it would probably depend upon the circumstances. I think there's no a priori reason why you couldn't have a group of production facilities that together give rise to a set of credits within a particular project, but it would probably depend upon the relationship between the activities and economic ownership and things like that. So I don't think without knowing more, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question.
If I can say more on this, there will be there are 40 factories in a cluster of leather factory, in a cluster of leather tanning industry. They have an association, So can we do it through an association, a common association where all the 40 factories are members?
I like Nick said, I see no reason that you wouldn't be able to. I think the important thing there would be to make sure there's just paper documenting who has the rights to the carbon credits. But again, without sort of looking at all the details, it's tough to answer. But I don't see any reason why not.
Yeah, I think it will also depend on sort of the commonality. So if you have, let's say, one energy efficiency improvement that is applied across those companies, I don't see any reason why you can't group it. It's essentially what the clean cooking example does as well. It's different households, but they're all applying a similar technology. So that again could be applied by your association as well. And I think in principle, and I think it's definitely not excluded up front.
But I was going to give the same example. If they all invest in a renewable energy source, for example, and then they share the fruits of that renewable energy source, that's probably a really good example of something where it would work. But if they all do something slightly different to reduce emissions, and they're economically independent, even if they are working through a trade association, it's probably harder. But I mean, I think this is maybe a a good way to explain that each of the registries has its own set of rules and standards, and they can be quite different, and they can be quite idiosyncratic. I mean, we had a client that was looking at running a project and wanting to know if they could get credits for the project, and we had conversations with, I think, 4 different registries to sort of try to understand the parameters around the rules. And the rules were all quite different. For some registries, the project might not have been eligible at all. In others, the project might have been eligible with certain tweaks here and there. So it really does depend. And that was a point that I made when I described the different stakeholders. Which was I think you start with your idea for an offset project, and you then need to develop that idea in light of what the rules and standards are for the different registries, and figure out, what's your best home for your registration, also accounting for things like price, but taking signals from those rules and standards and tweaking your project as you go. Thanks.
Thank you. I understand the general requirements or the objective of what you have said. I fully understood. We need to work more, and I think definitely it's a very good guidance which is given by you all, the 3 experts. I think we will work on it because it's an important thing, and we would like to work on it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sushil. And you have quite a few emails already shared in the chat from Nicholas and the other presenters. So please feel free to also perhaps reach out with more information and more questions. So we have another question from Taupe. Taupe, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the session. I'll quickly run through it. So we have a project that facilitates recovery of recyclable materials, and we get this recyclable materials to manufacturing companies that use them as raw materials for their manufacturing. So we were looking at exploring how we could, because we have the data of the volume of materials that is recovered, and we try as much as possible to try to make the process transparent. So we're looking at how to explore converting this recovered recyclable materials into carbon credit. I'm not sure exactly how do we calculate the carbon credit emission saved, like what's a standardized calculator that is available, and how exactly can we use those carbon emissions saved in the carbon credit market and to get something done in that light.
Yeah, thanks. Again, another interesting question. I think just in general, waste management projects are also typical carbon credit projects. So again, in principle, I think such an energy efficiency or / waste management project could be eligible for carbon credits. And then I think it's again a question of which methodologies are available, which will depend on each register. So some of the registers may have methodologies that will help you to calculate that level of carbon credits that could be generated based on your project. And again, if no such methodology already exists, then you can propose your own methodology. And those registers will more likely accept your methodology if it's also a methodology that they could apply elsewhere. So the more generic your methodology is, in a sense, the easier they will accept that methodology. But again, based on what you've just said, I would say this is something that you need to explore further, and that again, through our pro bono project, we may be able to help as well. It's in and of itself, I think if you need the financing from carbon credits to get your project rolling, that in and of itself may show that there is additionality, and that may make it possible for you to get carbon credits. So once that methodology is approved, then the carbon credits that you will get is essentially the difference between what I've called the baseline emissions, which are the emissions that would have happened without you implementing your waste management improvement, against the actual emission reductions that have been achieved through your project. So that delta, that difference, will result in carbon credits that you can then sell on the carbon credit market. I don't know where my colleagues want to jump in here as well. Or...
Yeah, I just want to mention, just as a general point, that the existing approved methodologies are available to download and read from Vera's website, from Gold Standard's website. They're published methodologies, so you can take a look at those to get an idea of quantifying impact and baseline data.
So yeah, if you can box your methodology into one of those approved methodologies, it's going to make it much easier for you. And again, it just shows you also why this is still really a market that is not yet settled, because there are so many differences among the registers, also in terms of the specific methodologies that they have approved. So it's also quite labor intensive to go through those methodologies, but you could also try to engage directly with the registers and present your project as well. What some registers have as well, and that might be relevant not only for you but for us as well, is that if you have a project that you believe might be eligible for registration under one of the programs, then you could put in a sort of a concept note where you sketch the project that you have in mind and you sketch the proposed methodology without going into too much detail. And based on that concept note, they can give you a preliminary idea, a yes or no, on whether it would indeed be sensible to go forward and to look more closely into the project that you have in mind. So that sort of concept note is something that might be useful for you and for others to explore as well, once you've made up essentially your idea that you want to go forward and seek the development of a carbon credit project. Yeah, I see that we have more questions. I think about, yeah, Claire, I think, yeah.
Yes, we have quite a few more. I've said we can take 2 more questions, but I see Emma has also raised her hand, so let's see. But yes, Abedenyo, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the session. I have a quick question. So can a carbon credit project be for profit? So you set up the whole project to generate profits?
That's a straightforward one. It can be for profit. I think that's part of what makes it a win-win.
Yeah, the idea is that you need the financing from the sale of the carbon credit to get the project off the ground. That's sort of the additionality requirement. But and then that's maybe too much detail. That's why I've not discussed it yet during the presentation. Even if your project would be viable without carbon credit, the revenue from a carbon credit, in some cases it could still be eligible if there are other burdens that do not allow you to get the project off the ground. So essentially, if you need sort of the infrastructure and the help of project developers and the trust in that system for your project to go up and running, even if it would be financially viable without the revenue from a carbon credit, in such a situation, it could also still be acceptable.
Great. Thanks so much. So Uchenna, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I think a lot of my questions has actually been recently answered. I was going to ask if I initiate a project or I decide to develop a project, would I be able to receive help with designing it? You know, yeah, I mean, for someone who's not, you know, yeah, it's not my core job. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There are technical advisors and so-called carbon consultants who can help with the design and implementation of a project. They can also review the quantification data, put together project idea notes, feasibility studies, and eventually the project design document that you would submit to the registry.
Thank you.
Great. So we will take a last one from Emma, and that will be the end. Over to you, Emma.
Hi, thank you guys so much. So I have a quick question as well, and I kind of alluded to it in the chat, but my company is looking at developing a project that handles or will develop both carbon and plastic credits. And so I was wondering if, first of all, plastic credits would be in your expertise. I know it's in kind of a developing market, but could this fall under the pro bono program, or would it just be the carbon credits?
Hi, Emma. Thanks for your question. I think it's fair to say that, that we don't have, at this moment in time, a lot of expertise on the plastic credits. We have actually been doing quite a lot of thinking around plastics, though, including working with some of the different stakeholders on issues around the negotiation of the new UN Plastics Treaty. So definitely interested in thinking about plastic credits and how that might work. So yeah, please do reach out to us and we can begin a conversation on that. And Claire, I see that Kojo has a hand up, and I don't know about others, but I think it would be a shame not to take that last question.
Sure, great. Go ahead then. Kojo, over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for a brilliant presentation. Okay, so we are in the agro-business space, and we are looking to go into the plantation of coconuts to help feed our factory. And I just want to find out, how can this project benefit from carbon credit project?
So are you saying you're using, I think I misunderstood you. Are you're using coconuts as a source of energy?
Okay, so one, it's a source of raw material for our product, for our factory. And then, so basically the rest, every part of the coconut fruit we intend to use. But it's the farm that we are talking about. Can we get carbon credits for it?
Yeah, I think the initial question there is whether there's an existing methodology that would demonstrate additionality and the like that Dom has covered, or whether you would need to approve a new one. Propose a new one to get approved for use by one of the registries. I don't know off the top of my head where that would fit in. Potentially, there are approved methodologies for land use and promoting biodiversity. That might be somewhere to start. But yeah, the first step would be determining which methodology would fit the activities you're describing.
Yeah, it also needs to, of course, result in emission reductions.
Right.
And it's only once your project achieves emission reductions beyond what you would have normally achieved that you could start thinking about generating carbon credits.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I think that is our last question. So excellent. We are 15 minutes over time, but well worth it. So really appreciate all of our excellent speakers for taking those great questions. Thanks to the audience for having your questions ready to go. You'll see in the chat that Diana has actually shared the speakers' email addresses, so feel free to reach out to them with more questions. Although please do not spam our excellent speakers. Please make sure your questions are clear and concise. And with that, I think we can close out this session. But before we let you all go, just wanted to once again share the registration link for our next session, which this is actually part of a two-part series led by Sidley Austin. So you'll see that we have another episode coming up on the 25th of May, same time as this session. And this will be talking about insurance schemes against climate shocks. So if you're here today, you're actually already registered for that session. So please use the same link to join that episode on the 25th of May. If you like this session and you wanted to share it with other friends or colleagues, please feel free to use the registration link that I've shared in the chat to ensure that this knowledge can get into as many hands as possible. And with that, once again, thank you so much to Ada and Diana for facilitating the links to Jason, Nicholas, and Dominic. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll see you all again on the 25th of May. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.